Hi, I'm Dr. Celine Latulip from the University of Manitoba. This video is NeedFindingPart2, and this is for the NSERC Create User-Centered Design module. So in part 1 video, we talked about surveys and interviews as fairly standard and common techniques for need finding. Now in this video, we're going to focus on some other techniques that are maybe not quite as well known, but are also really useful. Observation and Think Aloud, focus groups, and diary studies. And we're also going to talk briefly about personas, which is not so much a need-finding technique as a data representation technique. So let's start with observation and Think Aloud. In observation, what we're doing is just watching people in their natural environment, at their workplace, in their home, out and about, wherever they're doing whatever it is that we're interested in studying. And this is really useful when the participant might have difficulty explaining to us how they do what they do, or what the setting is like, or what the environment is like. So we can fill in those details by doing observation. And this is great. It results in a lot of data because you can take a lot of notes, you can take video, you can take photos, etc. And then you have to actually deal with that data. So that can be a bit of a downside of observation, is figuring out how to deal with all of the data you collect. So often we pair observation with Think Aloud. And in Think Aloud, what we're doing is asking the participant or the subject or the user, whatever term you want to use, to verbalize what they're thinking as they go about doing the activity that you're interested in. And this is really useful because we can get that internal representation and understanding that the user has in their mind of how things work and why they do the things they do. And we can also sort of take this a little bit further into something that we would call cooperative or participative evaluation. And this is where we relax the version of Think Aloud, and we don't just sort of observe and keep reminding the user to think out loud, but we actually stop them and ask them questions. So both of these things are really good. There is one major drawback to doing this kind of Think Aloud type version of observation, and that is that there's extra cognitive load. It actually is a lot of work for a user to just go about doing what they're doing, but also say everything that's happening in their brain about why they're doing this and what they're seeing and what they're responding to. So you don't want to ask users to think aloud for a long time, because it will just tire them out, and that will actually impact, whatever it is that they're doing. So here's some tips if you're doing observations. You want to look at everything about the users and their environment. So it's not just them, but where they are and how they're reacting to what's happening around them. And one way to think about this is as describing it to someone who's never been there or seen this place or seen anybody do this activity before. So you also want to pay attention to what the users say is important, but also the nonverbal details, like their body language and how they place things and things like that. And whenever possible, if you can, you want to document all of this with photos and video and audio if you have the user's permission. And in some cases, when you're in sensitive areas, that may not be appropriate. So you want to pay attention to things like the physical environment, where they're doing the task, what kind of space they have, lighting levels, noise level, all of that type of stuff. Are they standing, sitting, or moving around while they do whatever it is that you're studying? Do they have power available? Is there any danger? Right? So those are physical environment aspects that you want to take note of. The technical environment may be relevant. What computers or devices or cell phones are they using? Is this something that they're doing that requires networking, that's wired or wireless? Are they using mobile devices? That kind of thing. And then the social environment. And this is something that I think people often forget, but are the people that you're studying interacting with others? And are there issues that you can observe that are about peer pressure or exclusion? Are there social norms about how people interact in that place or in that activity? And would there be social implications? So if you're proposing some kind of system to put in there, do you need to consider interruption or privacy or the reputation of the person you're designing for, or power balances, things like that? So those are all types of things you want to try to take notes on if you're doing an observation. All right, let's move on quickly to focus groups. So this is an interesting technique that's used a lot, obviously, in business and marketing. And what happens with focus groups is you gather 3 to 10 people who are typically sort of in your target audience that you're designing for, or they might be stakeholders that you wouldn't be designing directly for, but would, be influenced or impacted by what you design. And this is usually run by somebody who's a facilitator who really knows how to run focus groups, because it's tricky and it takes some practice. So you can think of this as being like a group interview. You're asking a series of questions, and it might last about 90 minutes. But it's a fairly small set of questions because you want to give everybody who's participating a chance to answer. And so the facilitator will note who has had a chance to say an answer in response to each question, but it's not necessarily going to be like going around the table and asking everybody one by one to answer. It's going to be more like somebody says something, somebody else responds, there's a conversation, and the facilitator is going to try to make sure that he or she has heard from every participant on each question topic. So the benefits of a focus group is that for participants, this can feel like a lower pressure environment than an individual observation or interview, because they're just one of a group of people, and the focus isn't solely on them. And the other benefit is that you can really get interesting conversations going where somebody says something and someone else is like, oh yeah, that reminds me of, and that type of thing. So you can get a lot of good conversation coming out of focus group because people like to interact with each other. The drawbacks of focus groups is that it's really easy to see groupthink happening. And that happens when the facilitator poses a question and somebody comments or responds to it with a very strong opinion that then everybody else kind of sort of just falls in line with and says, yeah, I agree, or what have you. And especially when there's somebody who has really strong opinions, other participants in the focus group may be really hesitant to actually contradict that person. So overbearing or outgoing participants can sometimes take over a conversation, and it takes a facilitator sort of a lot of skill to make sure that they're bringing everybody back into the conversation and being polite to the overbearing person, but making sure that they don't take over. You also need to be aware of privacy and confidentiality. When you're conducting a single interview with a single participant, they would trust that you as the researcher are not going to repeat anything that they said in an inappropriate way. But when you're in a group of people, you can't actually guarantee that somebody else in the focus group is not going to go out of the room and repeat what someone said. Now, so you need to sort of remind participants that they're supposed to keep the information in the focus group confidential, but you should also remind participants that you can't guarantee that everybody else will, and so they should sort of be careful of what they say. Audio and video is really great if you can record it in a focus group. In particular, audio is usually useful. It can be difficult to transcribe though, because you have so many different voices, and that's why video can help, because you can see who's speaking. But sometimes, depending on the topic, you may not be able to audio or video record, and you may just have to take notes. And in that case, you would have a facilitator and a note taker, because one person really can't play both of those roles. Okay, the last method that I want to talk to you about is diary studies. And this is kind of a fun technique where what you're doing is actually collecting small bits of data from a single user over time to understand something about how things work in their regular daily life. So a diary study might last a few days or weeks or even months, and you're basically pinging the individual, the participant, maybe every day at the same time, or maybe it's a couple of times a day at random times, or maybe it's a couple of random times each week over 3 months, that type of thing. And then you're asking them to just respond to a couple of questions that are really quick. And that way you can sort of understand. It might be something like, this is often used with eating habits. So what was the last snack you had, kind of thing. And so by studying that over 3 months, you can get a real sense of a user's sort of real habits. And this is much better than asking a user to tell us, well, what kind of snacks do you usually have? Because they're going to recall maybe not necessarily accurately. This originally was done on paper with journals or diaries, which is why it's called a diary study. It then moved to being done through phone calls or text prompts. And now this type of study is often mediated by a mobile app that you download onto your smartphone. So this, like I said, this gives you real life samples of real data, which is more reliable than asking participants to recall, well, what are the snacks you ate over the last 3 months? And it's great because these are quick, easy interactions for a participant if they're designed well. The drawbacks is that this often requires users to install something on their phone. It can potentially interrupt participants in their daily life, and that may actually have some privacy issues. And the regular expected interruptions could actually cause a user to change their behavior. Like, oh, I bet that app is going to ask me what snack I had, so I'm going to have the cheese and crackers instead of the Doritos. And it also may require you to develop that app with data logging, and there could be data management issues that you need to deal with. So, okay. So those were the methodologies for need finding. Personas is a methodology for actually representing the data that you've gathered through your surveys and interviews and observations and diary studies. And a persona is basically a made-up description of a potential user, and you're making that description up based on all that information that you've collected. So it sort of represents a typical user, what they like to do, what they typically do, who they are, what their personality and status in life is, that kind of thing. And you may end up having to develop a bunch of different personas for the type of system you're designing. So the benefit is that you put a human face on abstract data, you usually actually give them a name and use a stock photo, and that then becomes this person that you can think of. It's easy to remember that person and talk about them. And then you can refer to the personas throughout the design cycle when you're unsure about how to choose something with respect to your design. So if you've got a persona that's, John, the elderly athlete, and you're designing this app and you're like, well, what would John do? Would John want it to look like this? Or would John be able to enter this data while he was walking? That type of thing. And it helps you make good decisions that are user-centered. So if you have a chance, I strongly encourage you to go to this URL, check out this link, because there are some great examples of these personas that were created by a company for Cisco, the networking company. And they created about, I think, 7 or 8 different personas representing different people. So their end user consumers, some of their resellers, the people who resell and install their systems. So they've got motivated Mitch and traveling Thomas and multitasking Millie. And each of these personas has kind of a tagline. They've got a set of, user characteristics and what they do with their life and all of that type of stuff. And so you can think about we're gonna set up this new software for managing local area networks. Well, motivated Mitch is going to want this, but traveling Thomas needs this other thing, right? And it really helps in the design process. So to recap what we've talked about, need finding techniques include things like surveys, interviews, observation and think aloud, focus groups, and diary studies. And these have all been traditionally used in human-computer interaction. There are more modern techniques for user research that our colleagues will talk about, but these are some very standard traditional ones. And then representation of that data that you collect. Of course, you can do some statistical analysis of quantitative survey data and things like that, but you can often create really great representations through personas that are very useful in your user-centered design process. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching.